Hello and welcome to today's Manhattan Town meeting for Saturday, May 28th. Our show today is entitled, Is the Enemy Us or Only Our British Imperial Axioms? Now, this past week, the Schiller Institute held two conferences. One, the United States and European military and security experts warned the insanity of politicians threaten nuclear war, and a second conference called We Need a New Security and Development Architecture for All Nations, not a strengthening of geopolitical blocs. These conferences are preparing the ground, have prepared the ground for the next 3 weeks organizing effort, which is to build a massive international Schiller Institute meeting, which will be done for June 18th and 19th. Now, the purpose of this is to continue and to advance the organizing with participation from as many nations as possible to create this new security and development architecture. We don't see this as simply something that will be created outside of our own efforts. Now, sections of both of these conferences of the past week have already been viewed by thousands and even tens of thousands of people. And it means that the people that have viewed these and have been part of them, have been participants in them, are now able in a position to use these two gatherings as a kind of intellectual platform through which to factionalize for sanity and against the escalation of war, which is continuing. Now, before we go to talking extensively about these two conferences, we want to address an important matter which has preoccupied particularly the United States, which is the agony of the recent shootings in Buffalo, New York, and Uvalde, Texas. People think about these as being unrelated to what's actually going on in the international situation as a whole. But we see that somewhat differently. We'd like to just show again the thumbnail of what we picked for today, which is the picture of Christ confronting the two possessed men who, upon his confronting them, ask him to cast out the demons inside of them and send them into the swine. This is sometimes referred to as the parable of the Gadarene swine. And so what I'm going to do is to just read to you from Matthew 8, verses 28 to 34, where he says, When Jesus reached the country of the Gadarenes on the other side of the lake, two demoniacs came out toward him out of the tombs, creatures so fierce that no one could pass that way. They stood there shouting, What do you want with us, Son of God? Have you come here to torture us before the time? Now, some distance away, there was a large herd of pigs feeding. And the devils pleaded with Jesus, If you cast us out, send us into the herd of pigs. And he said to them, Go then. And they came out and made for the pigs. And at that the whole herd charged down the cliff into the lake and perished in the water. The swineherds ran off and made for the town, where they told the whole story, including what had happened to the demoniacs. At this the whole town set out to meet Jesus. And as soon as they saw him, they implored him to leave the neighborhood. Now, this is a useful thing for us to think about if one wishes for a moment to make perhaps an analogy between the two shooters involved in the two killings in Buffalo, New York, and Uvalde, Texas, and the two possessed men. And then what occurred here. The idea is that we might want to, instead of looking at them, and looking what Christ did, let's look at the reaction of the town, which was to get rid of Jesus as soon as possible. This is important because the concept here is, are we the enemy, or are the Russians the enemy, or the Chinese the enemy, or are only the British imperial axioms that are presently at work, particularly in the transatlantic world, the appropriate point of reflection and concentration? Lyndon LaRouche, always the late economist and statesman, always made the point that if you're confronted by some sort of conundrum or paradox in which you're asked to see things a certain way, for example, the autocracies versus the democracies, or the West versus the rest, or any of those sorts of peculiar ways of formulating things, the best thing to do is to reject such conceptions. Try to look at a situation from the standpoint of the whole. So, for example, for 23 years, people in the United States have been trying to figure out why our youth are becoming serial killers. And it goes on and on every year. And people talk about guns, or they talk about this or that. But the problem never changes. The issue is perhaps the problem is being viewed from the wrong standpoint. In a 1996 exchange that he had with a member of an audience who was asking him about a very complex situation at the time, which was the military situation within the country of Lebanon, Lyndon LaRouche had the following recommendation.
We have to understand what's going on here, because you can't explain it, which is what people in Lebanon and so forth try to do. You can explain it in terms of a nation state, when that is not the controlling feature, nor is it just Syria, nor is it Israel. What you have, remember, go back to 1945, April 12th, 1945. And that's where all of these things begin to become clear, because if you don't put this in context, it isn't clear. Remember, the genius of Riemannian physical geometry is that you recognize that no event contains its own cause. No local phase space contains its own characteristics. You have to define what kind of physical space-time the universal space-time is, then you find the characteristic, then and only then can you understand. Now this may seem like mathematics or mathematical physics, but it happens to be everything is the same. That man's relationship to the universe is governed by certain laws. And in science, there is no division between social behavior, mathematical physical behavior, the cognitive processes of the human mind, and anything else. So we have to get to fundamentals in order to understand particulars. It is common practice to say, let's look at the particular, let's examine each particular question, try to answer those questions, then add the thing up and we'll get the world. On the contrary, especially now, you have to start from the world as a whole.
Starting from the world as a whole in order to be able to understand any circumstance. So let's take this issue of Ukraine and what is now going on with the war in Ukraine. People try to analyze this, but that can't be analyzed that way. In fact, what's been done is that people are being encouraged over and over to see things in a far, far different context than they actually occupy. This past week, in two separate conferences, Helge Sepp LaRouche, the founder and present chairman of the Schiller Institute, gave a presentation in which what she was doing was attempting to organize people and mobilize people for an upcoming series of conferences, including the one that we will be doing on June 18th and 19th. We're inviting all of you to help us organize. So she began the conference that happened just 2 days ago in the following way, and it then opened up a discussion. In that discussion, you'll also hear in order, actually, from Colonel Richard Black, former head of the U.S. Army Criminal Law Division, General Leonardo Tricarico, former Chief of Staff of the Italian Air Force, Eric Denisset, the director of the French Center on Intelligence Researches, and Ray McGovern, an analyst for Central Intelligence Agency. I'll be saying something just before we go to each speaker, but we want to just give you a sense of the array of people that had assembled for this purpose. So we begin with Helge's remarks.
Good morning. I greet you and want to invite you for this conference. So let me start with what is probably the most dangerous crisis in the history of mankind. Obviously, if it comes to a third world war, which this time would be nuclear, we would face the extinction of the human species. Because not only would there be a nuclear exchange of nuclear missiles, but following it would be a nuclear winter. And I think it was Kennedy who said, in a nuclear war, those who die first are the lucky ones, because what comes in the weeks to follow is so horrible that people would wish to be dead. Now, if that would happen, and we are very close to it, everything mankind ever produced would be worthless. All the beautiful compositions of Beethoven for nothing. The writings of Shakespeare, of Plato, Confucius, Pushkin, the great statecraft of people like Lincoln, Leonardo da Vinci, and I could go on with the list, all would be for nothing. There would be even not a historian left to investigate why this happened. Any policy consideration that does not start with that reflection is obviously insane, and out of it follows that everything has to be done to prevent the outbreak of nuclear war. Now, that reality does not prevent global Britain to play the nuclear chicken game. There was recently an article by Malcolm Chalmers, the Deputy Director General of the Royal United Service Institute, RUSI, and they describe themselves as the world's oldest and leading UK defense and security think tank, and they are closely associated with the British military and the British royal household. They are proposing a Cuban missile on steroids, that's how they call it, which could result over the Ukrainian attempt to retake Crimea, which would make it easier, in their view, to settle the Ukraine-Russia war. The headline of the article is, "This war still presents nuclear risks, especially in relation to Crimea," and it was published on May 20th. Chalmers discusses how Russia could be forced into a nuclear confrontation by sending ever more sophisticated weapons to Ukraine to boil the Russian frog. Now, you all know the story. If you throw, at least so the story goes, if you throw a frog into boiling water, the frog would jump out. But if you put the frog into cold water and then slowly turn up the heat, the frog gets cooked. Now, they think that boiling the Russian frog you can arrive at by progressively increasing the size and sophistication of the weapons they have prepared to supply Ukraine. So because of those weapons, Ukraine would then be able reversing the most of Russia's recent territorial gains, including Kherson and even Mariupol. Also, those weapons and territorial gains could be used to destroy bridges, railheads, storage sites, and air bases inside Russia. Then they would move to retake Crimea, strike at a, quote, tempting target like the Kerch Bridge, for example, and now this would lead to a Crimea missile crisis, Chalmers argues. A specific threat to use nuclear weapons in relation to Crimea might be viewed by Putin as a way to restore some of his coercive power if he and the United States doubted whether he would deliver on such a threat. If a red line were not accepted by Ukraine, Russia might then feel that it had to consider a series of further escalatory options, such as putting its nuclear forces on even a higher alert. They are already on alert. Faced with the alternative of the likely loss of Crimea, Putin might believe that the Ukraine, with the US encouragement, would be likely to blink first. It would be a moment of extreme peril, with all the parties seeking to understand the intent of each other, even as they looked to pursue their national interest. Precisely because of the peril inherent in such a situation, a nuclear crisis of this sort could make it easier for leaders to make a difficult compromise. Provided that the war was ended and the blockade of Odessa lifted, Ukraine leaders might be willing to postpone a settlement of the Crimea question. For Putin, the failure of the invasion and the subsequent success of the Ukrainian counteroffensive would have been a massive humiliation. But he would at least be able to argue that the might of the Russian strategic arsenal had, at the moment of great national weakness, successfully deterred NATO's designs for dismembering Russia. This could be enough for both sides to avoid the worst outcome of all. This is absolute, complete insanity. What he calls the Crimean-Cuba missile crisis on steroids would mean that the two largest nuclear powers would basically go to the absolute brink of nuclear war. Now, obviously, this RUSI is only a think tank, but it is one which informs British policy. And therefore, the question is this not a violation of Article 2, number 4 of the UN Charter? Because this is not just some form of incitement to war, but an incitement for nuclear war. And if there is no international legal definition of that yet, it would be very urgent to make one.
Richard Black, a decorated Vietnam War veteran and the former head of the U.S. Army's Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon, as well as a former Virginia state senator, describes in detail the nature of what we mean by an ultimate conflict such as thermonuclear war.
Now, President Biden says U.S. troops won't fight the Russians in Ukraine because this would lead to World War III. But at the same time, he signed a $40 billion Lend-Lease package reminiscent of the same one Franklin Roosevelt signed as he coaxed a reluctant nation into entering World War II. But there's a great difference between Franklin Roosevelt's world and Biden's world today. For Russia and the United States are the world's great nuclear superpowers. At any moment, each has 1,400 nuclear warheads standing at the ready for launch. Even if we did launch a massive surprise attack on Russia, we can never destroy her large fleet of nuclear submarines. Many of her hypersonic missiles would launch early, and many other bombs and missiles would survive the initial attacks. Russia would then retaliate, turning New York City and Washington, D.C. into radioactive glass. Few would survive in major metropolitan centers: Atlanta, Chicago, San Francisco, Detroit, Los Angeles. Yes, we would destroy Russia, and we would destroy China too. But neither Europe nor Asia would be spared. Japan would suffer a nuclear holocaust that would make Hiroshima and Nagasaki seem like brush fires. London would disappear from the earth. Paris, Brussels, Berlin, and Rome would perish. And for what? To enrich the sons of corrupt politicians who line their pockets with insider deals? For the glory of some demonic new world order? Henry Kissinger has called for peace negotiations within 2 months, before the war creates upheavals that cannot become overcome. He cautions us not to get swept up in the mood of the moment. Ambassador Arnaud, former French ambassador to the U.S. and UN, warns, right now we're sleepwalking to nobody knows where. But we know exactly where this leads. The unfolding phantasmagoria foreshadows nuclear war and a great apocalypse. Thank you.
General Leonardo Tricarchio, the former chief of staff of the Italian Air Force, who also spoke, was asked a question which concerned the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, and he took the opportunity to contrast and clarify the difference between that situation in 1962, 60 years ago, and that of today. Okay, we have a second question for the general, and then we'll resume the speakers. And this one is from Jeff Lindell, U.S. Air Force, retired. And he's asking, this pertains to the 1962 Cuban Missiles Crisis. And the question is, what is your opinion of the role of the United States deployment of Jupiter missiles to Italy and Turkey in triggering the Cuban Missile Crisis?
We are talking about an era in which there were we had balances. We had certainly the danger of destabilizing those balances, but we had a mechanism of compensation which has worked very well, so well that there was only that circumstance in which we were on the verge of the abyss. But later on, this balance of terror has become instead an instrument of destabilization as it's occurring today. Therefore, what should we do? We must terminate this escalation. There is no other way than negotiation. And it's natural that we must strengthen our defenses. This is out of question. From this standpoint, we in the West have an imperative duty, a commitment which we must take, because the balance towards missile threat, we must achieve this balance, like other countries have done, maybe better than us. Also because the Schiller Institute president evoked that family of missile vectors which we saw exhibited by Putin, which we hope will never be used, especially with lethal warheads.
Thank you very much, General Chiklariko. Now, in the conference that had happened, which was the day before, the Thursday conference, a conference that was sponsored in Sweden and Denmark to discuss why Finland should not be joining, Finland should not join NATO. A Danish journalist, Jens Jorgen Nielsen, gave a background to situate what's actually going on in Ukraine, which I think is invaluable for Americans to know. Take a look.
Well, back to what has happened, because in 1991, when Soviet Union was dissolved and the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, I traveled a lot in Russia. I was very much in Russia. I had Russian friends, and they were all enthusiastic. They were all optimistic. Now we're entering a new world. Now we have a new harmonious world marked by harmony and peace and development and things like that. They emphatically wanted to be part of the West. They wanted to share our values and things like that. So if you had this picture in the 90s, in the beginning of the 90s, it was very difficult to live in Russia because everything broke down and there was chaos, but they wanted to be part of the West. So the good question is, what actually happened? Why didn't it turn out this way? And there are several stepstones in this, I would say, because already in the beginning of the 90s, Bill Clinton, I would say when Bill Clinton came to power in United States in the beginning of the 90s, he first endorsed a plan of the Eastern European countries becoming part of NATO, leaving Russia outside. And thus, in this way, I would say he declined the proposal of Mr. Gorbachev to build a European house. There was actually built a European house, but it was a European house based on military and with Russia being outside. A European house, Russia being outside. And at this time in United Nations, even in Europe, many people warned, said that it would not work. It would definitely not work because even the liberals in Russia, and many of those very pro-Western liberals said it's a very bad idea. But it worked this way because Clinton was very, he was very insisting on this, and it started at this time. And then they had, I don't know if it was bad luck, maybe intentionally, that they adopted Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic at the same time as it started to bomb in Serbia. And Serbia is a very close ally historical ally for Russia. So at this time, I was a journalist at this time. I talked to a lot of people. I talked to Sakharov's widow, Yelena Bonner. I talked to all the liberals. I talked to whom not I talked to at this time. And everyone was very sharply opposed to this. At this time, I think if you should put a year. It was 1999. A year, for when the split actually began. Maybe it started a little earlier, but at this time it was obvious. And then Putin came. He came in this situation. He didn't create this situation. Many people think that the Russians were liberals, and then the evil Putin came along. No, it's the other way around. Actually, Putin took the agenda of the Russian people, and even not that, because funny enough, Putin was very eager to join NATO. It's very interesting to talk about this today. He wanted Russia to join NATO. At least he said so in an interview at BBC in 2000, when he just became president. But things, even in Afghanistan, Putin supported the West. He helped the West in Afghanistan. He did everything to become friend. He made a speech in the Bundestag, in the parliament in Berlin, and he did everything he could, but he found out in vain, because Russia was doomed to be left out of this new security architecture, because European security was NATO without Russia. And I think everything started to deteriorate from this. You could make some stepstones. I'll just mention a very few. You can say that in 2008, there was a NATO summit in Bucharest in Romania. And at this point, George W. Bush was the president at this time. He invited Georgia and Ukraine to NATO, to become part of NATO. Well, there was France and Germany was not that enthusiastic about this, so they actually turned it down. But it was kept on the agenda that they had, and that these two countries had an invitation. And Putin was present at this conference, and he was very, very angry, and opposed it, but nothing happened really. And you can say, as the solution at the NATO summit was the worst conceivable resolution, because first they made the Ukrainians and Georgians think that they would have the backing of NATO if they attack Russia, or like Saakashvili in Georgia did in 2008. And secondly, it raised the suspicion of the Russians, and it didn't solve anything.
A further European perspective on this was offered from France by Eric Denisset, director of the French Center on Intelligence Researches. Our next speaker is Eric Denisset, the director of the French Center on Intelligence Researches.
Hello. Before giving an analysis of the Ukrainian crisis, I would just like to make a few introductory remarks. First of all, I would like to express my sympathy to the people who are victims of this crisis, and also to say that if it is appropriate, of course, to denounce the Russian attack, it is also appropriate to denounce all the violations of international law, that is to say, those that led to the Ukrainian aggression in the Donbass, and unfortunately those that our American allies regularly carry out in the name of the fight against terrorism throughout the world, notably in 2003. What seems important to me today is to recall how we got there, and how this war, which should never have happened, ended up happening. It is not a question of being pro-Ukrainian or anti-Ukrainian, pro-Russian or anti-Russian, but of analyzing the facts with the coldness and the rationality which is required. First of all, it is important to remember that this war should never have taken place. It is a conflict that should have been avoided, and finally, in which all the actors today involved directly or indirectly have their share of responsibility. It is necessary to recall, first of all, a fact essential for me, which is that at the end of the Cold War, NATO should have been dissolved. It is an organization whose sole purpose was to protect the West from the Soviet threat, from the expansion of the proletarian revolution, and from the Soviet military threat, and it should have disappeared at the end of the Cold War. This simple fact of having kept it has been one of the origins of the problems we face today. We must also remember that for 30 years, whether we like it or not, there has been a real humiliation of Russia, unkept promises of the West, which have not only reinforced dissatisfaction but also Russian resentment towards the West. The lies that have been served to Moscow on a regular basis over the years have only increased the gap between the two parts of the European continent. Of course, there was also the Maidan coup. I recall that President Yanukovych, as corrupt as he was, like all his predecessors at the head of Ukraine, had been legally elected and recognized by the representatives of the OSCE, and that it was therefore a revolutionary coup d'etat which was carried out to remove him from power, supported by the West, and finally in violation of all democratic rules. It was followed quite quickly by the ostracization of the Russian-speaking populations of Donbass, and very swiftly by military aggression by the forces of Kiev against these populations, which are not separatist, as was too often announced in the media, but which were autonomous and wanted their autonomy to be recognized within the Ukrainian borders, and especially the free use of their language, which is Russian. But they were, of course, immediately countered by the power in Kiev, which wanted to have them fall in line again.
It's particularly notable that the speakers and participants in the conference came from their own point of view. Often these points of view disagreed among them, but the issue of the principle that war had to be avoided and that we are embarked on an insane pathway was the thing that unified them. The final speaker for the Thursday conference was Ray McGovern, an analyst for over 27 years with the Central Intelligence Agency, very well known in the United States. As a founding member of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. He first spoke about his solidarity with Colonel Richard Black on the question that he had posed as to whether or not the persons that were involved in this great game were in fact insane.
Colonel Black asks, have we all gone mad? A very legitimate question, given the nuclear aspect of all this stuff. Let me just address that very briefly by saying that Colonel Black was one of the main signers, one of 21, who signed our Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity memorandum to President Biden on 1 May. And what we said was mirrored just 1 week later by the head of the CIA and by the National Intelligence Director before the Senate Armed Services Committee. Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence, said to Senator Warner from Virginia, she said, now, Senator, we don't want nuclear war. We think that one of the main things that might prompt nuclear war is if Putin feels that he is about to be defeated in Ukraine. Now, she's an intelligence director. She doesn't make the policy. The policy clearly should be, hello, let's not make Putin perceive that he's going to be defeated in Ukraine. Otherwise, he may use nuclear weapons. I mean, anyhow, but the policy is different, isn't it? The policy is, therefore, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and many other politicians, therefore, we want total victory. As has already been said, we want total defeat for Putin. Doesn't make any sense.
McGovern also took the opportunity of his talking to remind people of an inconvenient fact concerning the Syrian conflict of 2012-2013 and the role of Vladimir Putin slightly later.
Some of you may remember, because it was just 9 years ago, that we were on the verge of war against Syria, open war, Tomahawk missiles and that kind of thing, okay? Who bailed Obama out? Well, the fellow's name happened to be Vladimir Putin. What did he say? He said, we know you guys are accusing Bashar al-Assad, president of Syria, for launching a chemical attack outside Damascus. We don't think that's right. We think you've been mousetrapped, but nevertheless, we've done a deal with the Syrians. We've agreed with them to load up all their chemical weapons under UN supervision and have them destroyed, if you'll allow it, on one of your warships, specifically outfitted to destroy chemical weapons. And Obama said, really? Because Kerry didn't tell him about that. But they were working on it. And the reason I mention all that is because that was the zenith. That was the high point of relations between the United States of America and Russia over recent decades.
raised the suggestions as to what should be done about this matter, sometimes startle some, particularly because of his own background as a CIA analyst. Unlike Colonels Black and Generals Tricarico, he has a certain relationship to the peace movement, and he spoke about that at the conclusion of his remarks.
Blessed are you when people insult you, slander you, persecute you. Be glad about that. You're in good company. That's exactly what they did to the earlier prophets. That's easier said than done, but I think we need to do that. We need to keep doing that. And there's a typical American trait that I've run into where people are reluctant to do something that they might not be successful in, you know? In other words, who wants to be laughed at? Who wants to go out and do something on principle and then have people say, Ray, what did you think you were doing by turning your back on a warmonger political figure? So there's this natural reluctance not to do things that our heart underneath the surface would prompt us to do. And one of my prophets is Daniel Berrigan, who would have been 101 just last month. And what he said was, look, you know, after we did that action outside of Baltimore, burning draft cards, we were in the only federal office building in this small little town. It was a post office. And we're sitting around, and I'm thinking to myself, whoa, this was a big action. Was it worth doing? Were we crazy? That's what everyone will say. Were we just trying to grab attention, or was it worth doing? And then, says Daniel Berrigan, it occurred to me, look, Dan, the good is worth doing because it's good. Now, results are not unimportant, but they're secondary to the goodness of the act. You got to go ahead and do it, okay? Now, Dan Berrigan was not only a courageous person, he was a poet.
While these observations made by all of the various speakers were very important at the conference was intended to begin a dialogue. And there was a moment in the questions and answers at this conference on Thursday where Helga Sepp-LaRouche asked the question posed primarily to Ray McGovern and to Colonel Richard Black, but also to other of the participants that were no longer on the line. She felt that her question was not answered. And what that question had to do with is, how do you get the United States, as well as other nations, but the transatlantic world, to deal honestly with the new relationship that has now emerged in the world, involving not only Russia and China, but actually the majority of the world's nations. And this has happened in various forms. And we're going to speak about this in just a minute. But in order for us to get a kind of approach that question, we've now sort of given an overview for you of the various points of view at that conference and said some things about the overall context, certainly some things which would startle most concerning the issue of Ukraine and so on. But to bring the discussion to the next level, I've asked that two people join us today, and they are Michelle Rasmussen, Vice President of the Schiller Institute in Denmark, who was instrumental in organizing the Wednesday conference on why Finland and Sweden should not join NATO, and Richard Black, Schiller Institute representative at the United Nations. We're going to start with you, Richard, and any comments both that you have in terms of what you've heard, but more importantly, your own view about this question that Helga posed and what the nature of the answer to it is.
Thank you, Dennis. I want to give you a report on a third conference which occurred this week, which I believe is epoch-making and part of an international dialogue process among heads of state and key individuals globally, including the leadership of the Schiller Institute. The meeting was a couple of days ago of the Eurasian Economic Union. It was in the Kyrgyz Republic. Now, the Eurasian Economic Union itself is a small organization. It's 5 nations: Russia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and the Kyrgyz Republic. But what occurred at this meeting, which was keynoted by Russian President Putin, what occurred was, I believe, epic making, because at this meeting there were nations and organizations far beyond the Eurasian Economic Union. And the topic really was the creation of a new world, as LaRouche would put it, a much better Earth's next 50 years. Putin's keynote was, I would say, epic shaping, and I'll go through that in a couple of moments. And in a certain sense, it's a fulfillment of a forecast or prophecy that Lyndon LaRouche made about 18 years ago, which was published in a book of his essays called Earth's Next 50 Years. The specific essay by LaRouche, it was a major paper, was from 2004, and he entitled it Towards a Second Treaty of Westphalia, The Coming Eurasian World. In it, he says, the subject to which we have been moving is the urgency of promoting, among both Asians and non-Asians alike, an informed sense of those means of self-development needed to establish the kind of understanding needed for a permanent community of fruitful cooperation among what we may distinguish today as the natural successor to the intent of the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia. That is, a community of sovereign nations dedicated to promote each the advantage of the other. This is from The Coming Eurasian World, Lyndon LaRouche, 2004. The events of this week at both the conferences which Dennis has been reporting on and which Michelle will report on, and this conference in Kyrgyz Republic, brings to my mind the opening line of a John Keats sonnet, "Great spirits down on earth are sojourning." Something extraordinary has been unleashed, and that is the creation of a new set of relations among nations and a new world economic order. And that was the topic of this meeting of the Eurasian Economic Union. President Putin, in his speech, said, he began by saying that the current major trend in the world is that the world development will move into the Asia-Pacific region. He said that we have done in Russia everything we can to ensure the sovereignty of nation states and the sovereignty of Russia. And he focused on an idea that Lyndon LaRouche had developed over the decades from LaRouche's first visits to Russia in 1994. And Putin said this in response to the blitzkrieg of sanctions being rained down upon Russia and anybody that deals with Russia. Putin said on Thursday, "What is important for the country, for its development," and I have said this many times and I repeat it, what is important is the emerging centers and the research centers, the engineering centers that are the basis of our own development. This is what we must think about, what we must work on, both within the Eurasian Economic Union and in a broad sense with our partners, that is, those who want to cooperate with us. Life itself has now forced us to invest there. The engineering centers and the research centers. Now, this is a key shift in Russia, wherein the academies of sciences have been left somewhat greatly underfunded over the last number of years. Putin described a greater Eurasian partnership, and he said, as he ended his speech, something quite striking. He said, quote, "It would be no exaggeration to say that Greater Eurasia is a big civilizational project. The Greater Eurasian Partnership is designed to change the political and economic architecture and guarantee stability and prosperity of the entire continent." So this idea of a civilizational project, a shift in the direction that humanity is going, away from the war, imperialism, hyperinflation, destruction of the global South. This is what was focused on by President Putin, quite sharp and quite congruent with the outlook being expressed by the Chinese leadership, Premier Li Keqiang, President Xi. Now, there were 6 panel discussions in addition to a plenary session and an executive meeting. At one of the plenary sessions, the title was "Interaction Between the Eurasian Economic Union and Promising International Partners." And at this dialogue, you see the way this relatively small organization has now branched out and is encompassing really a majority of the world's nations. Among the speakers were very importantly, the head of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This is Ambassador Zhang Ming, one of China's senior ambassadors, formerly was the ambassador of China to the European Union, and an extremely senior figure in the Chinese hierarchy. In addition to Ambassador Zhang, which I'll get to in a moment, was the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, Sergei Glaziev, the Director of Eurasian Integration at the Eurasian Economic Union, and a longtime collaborator of Lyndon LaRouche and the Schiller Institute, the Minister of Trade and Industry from Vietnam, the Russian ASEAN Business Council chief, the head of the Russia-Africa Partnership Forum, and the Vice Minister for Trade and Investment of Venezuela. So what came together was a working executive group to discuss leaving the failed neoliberal economic system in current collapse. How do we create a new one? What is its shape? Now, what was quite extraordinary is the senior Chinese ambassador, Ambassador Zhang, said the following. Mark this closely. The population of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is over 3 billion people. This is half the population of the Earth. Using our resources, we should cooperate with the world and promote the domestic market. Changes in the world now are of a colossal nature, but they also provide new opportunities for development. The Eurasian Economic Union and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization should unite. Only by joining forces will we be able to build a new world order. Now, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization includes India, Pakistan, China, Russia, including many others in Eurasia. And Sergei Glaziev, over the last several years, has said, although my role in the Eurasian Economic Union is kind of like an engine of ideas, our group of 5 nations is too small to launch a new world system. It would have to be done by an organization of much broader expanse and power, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, represented on Thursday by Ambassador Zhang. To give you a further sense of the dialogue, this is a living, breathing, life and death debate. Remember, the policy of NATO, London, and Washington is to crush Russia and destroy China. And that's not an inference, that's the stated policy of Brussels, London, and Washington. And the response of the world is no. Humanity is not going in that direction. The director of the Eurasian Economic Union, Mikhail Myasnakovich said, quote, "In my opinion, not only trade and payments in national currencies should be on our agenda, we need to discuss the construction of an independent monetary system, an independent currency system. The world is changing fast. A qualitative new system of axes, priorities, values in international economic, political, and humanitarian relations is taking shape." So, while the discussions of the Schiller Institute involving dozens of diplomats, leading experts, as Dennis was just reporting, led by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, while that was going on, this discussion among heads of state, at this meeting, major agreements were signed with Iran, Indonesia, Venezuela. The president of Cuba was there. This was not a small Asian meeting. And to give you a bit of background, this is a certain kind of inflection point in a very intensive process that has gone on through the winter and spring. In March, there was a meeting of Glaziev's group at the Eurasian Economic Union with the team from the Changyang Institute of Financial Studies of Renmin University, our friend Dr. Wang Wen. And the dialogue at that March meeting, headed up by Sergei Glaziev and Wang Wen, was how to create a new monetary system based upon the productive development of populations and the transfer of advanced technology, energy-intense technology, to the global south. And there were all kinds of reports in the media speculating about the importance of this discussion. The discussion was in March extremely concrete. What are the features of the new monetary system? How do we run trade based upon national currencies? How do we evaluate currencies based upon productive potential, referring to LaRouche's conception of currencies based on a basket of commodities and the productive power of labor. So this occurred in March. It was a private meeting, but described in much of the Asian press. In April, there was a meeting in Moscow of the so-called Sparrow's Hill group. And this likewise was headed up by Glaziev, business leaders, academics, economic experts. Additionally, the deputy speaker of the Russian Duma, the lower house, and one of the party leaders of one of the main party participants in the Duma. So you had executive members of the Russian government with civil society, expert economists, talking about we must have a new monetary system now. For Russia, it's a matter of life and death. For humanity, it's a matter of life and death. So what is coming to the fore, what has come to the fore this week, is a very expanded process whereby the great sovereign powers of Russia, China, India are making their moves. And if we can get a negotiated process going in Ukraine, if we can avoid nuclear annihilation, which is a likely possibility, if that can be avoided, what is taking shape are the details and the advanced conceptions of a new set of international relations. Interestingly, in Moscow last month at the Sparrow Hills meeting, the discussion was Hamiltonian economics, directed credit, the augmentation of heavy industry, the guaranteeing of a certain income for the labor force. It could have been lifted straight out of the economic writings of Alexander Hamilton. And I just want to conclude, I don't know if we have the quote for the screen. I want to conclude by reminding people what Russia has contributed over the last many hundreds of years since the founding of the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1724, from the standpoint, from the outlook of Lyndon LaRouche. And this is a paper by LaRouche from October, November 2001. LaRouche wrote, "The case of Russia's character as a distinctive Eurasian nation is a case in point. The role which Russia is potentially capable of playing in the currently unfolding history of mankind is the role which should be adduced from the appropriate apprehension of the character of a Russia, under the law of the general welfare, as a distinct personality of distinguishing characteristic intentions. Russia will be able to act effectively as a nation to the degree it is able to direct and sustain its efforts under the governance of a properly selected intention consistent with its personality as a well-defined quality of sovereign nation-state. The definition of Russia's role as a nation of science is an essential integral feature of its nature. An efficient historical role as a sovereign nation-state personality at this juncture in world history." So this is from Lyndon LaRouche from his paper, The Legacy of Mendeleev and Vernadsky, The Spirit of Russia's Science. And what we saw this week at this pivotal meeting in the Kyrgyz Republic was a discussion of physical economy as Lyndon LaRouche has defined it, and I believe a reassessment of Russia's identity, in fact, as a nation of science, that is, of physical economic power capable of helping to transform with China and hopefully with the United States a devastated global South. So I think from these three conferences which occurred this week, we have a tremendous work ahead of us.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Richard. And I'm glad to see Michelle is with us. Michelle Rasmussen, who is the vice president of the Schiller Institute in Denmark and also has a unique view of the United States. So anything you'd like to say, Michelle, at all? Because, of course, we're very interested in the conference that happened that was primarily being organized from Europe, which preceded the conference we had here. But anything else that you'd like to tell us subsequent to what happened, so on.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Thank you for inviting me to be on the program. After the outbreak of war in Ukraine, there was a dramatic shift in the defense policy in Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. In Denmark, there was a national defense compromise involving 5 of Parliament's parties, including to hold a referendum on June 1st, this coming Wednesday, about abolishing the Danish European Union Defense Cooperation opt-out. What this has to do with is that the only way that Danish voters approved the EU Maastricht Treaty was after 4 opt-outs were negotiated, including that Denmark would not participate in EU military activities. And now, as a measure to increase militarization, they want to abolish this opt-out, and the voters on Wednesday have to decide yes or no. But as Dennis said, the only, and what we heard from the excerpt from LaRouche, the only way to understand a single factor is by understanding the whole. And Lyndon LaRouche was truly a master of this. So we wanted to make an intervention to approach the Danish discussion from the highest level. So we started to organize a seminar. And then just at that time, the Swedish and the Finnish governments announced their decision to apply for NATO membership. So we made it a joint seminar sponsored by the Schiller Institutes in Denmark and Sweden, entitled, "We Need a New Security and Development Architecture for All Nations, Not a Strengthening of Geopolitical Blocs." Subtitled, "No in the Danish June 1st referendum about abolishing the EU defense opt-out, and no to Sweden and Finland joining NATO." And the idea was to broaden the space dimension by discussing the entire international strategic situation, and to broaden the time dimension, to go back in time to answer how did we get here, actually facing the possibility of nuclear war. And going forward in time, how do we avoid an escalation of the current war, even to nuclear war? And going further ahead in time, how can we prevent that future conflicts lead to war? LaRouche always said that the future determines the present. So the goal must be to establish a new international security and development architecture. And that determines what we have to do now. My view is that the Schiller Institute's role is not to defend this war because the war is a tragedy, but to make it very clear how we got to this tragic result, including, emphatically, the responsibility on the Western side and what we have to do to prevent a worse tragedy. As it turned out, our initiative for the May 25th seminar coincided with your May 26th seminar, becoming in effect a 2-day international conference centered first in Europe and then in the United States, with Helge Zepp-LaRouche giving the keynotes at both events. At the Danish-Swedish seminar, we had at least 72 people directly in the Zoom meeting, and there were 450 who saw the live stream, with 2,500 at this counting seeing it afterwards. So the speakers besides Helge were Jens Jørgen Nielsen, who you heard a clip from. He was the Moscow correspondent for the leading Danish daily Politiken in the late 1990s. He is the author of several books about Russia and Ukraine, and a leader of the Russian-Danish Dialogue Organization, and he's associate professor in communication and cultural differences at the Niels Brock Business College in Denmark. And he spoke about the background leading up to the current war. And then we had a speech called Why We Need a New Security Architecture, and also going into depth about the question of Sweden and Finland joining NATO by Jan Öberg, who is a peace and future researcher and art photographer. He has been a visiting professor in many countries, and he's the founder and director of the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research in Lund, Sweden, as well as being an author. Then we had a speech entitled The Chinese Proposals for a New Security and Development Architecture, Xi Jinping's April proposal for a new international security architecture, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Global Development Initiative. And this was by Professor Li Xing. Professor, he's the director of Development and International Relations Institute. And he's also professor of politics, a professor in the Department of Politics and Society in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Aalborg University in Denmark, and an author. Then Ulf Sandmark, the chairman of the Schiller Institute in Sweden, spoke more extensively about why Sweden and Finland should not join NATO. And I gave a short report about why Denmark should not intensify its geopolitical military engagements. And I want to tell you a little bit about the organizing process on the Danish side. When we decided to have the seminar, our outreach coordinator, activist Plaben, and we mapped out a strategy. Plaben, he has perfected a technique of being able to extract emails from any text. And we sent out hundreds of invitations. And this helps to create a field of intervention over and above those who actually registered. We proceeded in the process of inviting governments to participate through their embassies. We invited all embassies in Denmark, including those that cover Denmark from other countries, all embassies in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and 2 of the Baltic countries, plus, for example, all Turkish embassies in Europe. And the embassy registrations, they just started ticking in by themselves. And we also contacted diplomats that we already knew. Some of them resulted from another organizing strategy invented by another activist. He proposed that instead of sending invitations by email, that we should drive around to areas in Copenhagen where there is a dense concentration of embassies and ask for drop-in meetings. And we did this before the last 2 seminars. One was an international webcast, and another one was a special seminar that we had here in Denmark in October about the critical situation in Afghanistan. And we actually got drop-in meetings with many diplomats along our way. So the result this time was that 25 embassies registered from different Nordic and Baltic countries, and at least 11 of them did participate in the Zoom seminar, and we have sent recordings to the rest. Regarding the politicians, we sent email invitations to all Danish and Norwegian parliamentarians and many Danish city councilmen. We sent to academic institutions, the Defense College, think tanks, peace groups, and of course our own Schiller members and contacts, asking them to organize it. Some of the speakers put it out on their networks. It was the invitations were put out on the home pages of the Schiller Institute in Denmark, Sweden, Germany, and United States. And the U.S. Schiller Institute put out a mass email announcing it, and there was also organizing for the meetings by some of the European and U.S. members. In terms of responses, one significant response that I want to bring up now was from one of the speakers, Dr. Li Xing, the Chinese professor in Denmark. He wrote afterwards to me, he said, "What I wish to express myself is the fact that the seminar was very good and very conducive to promote what used to be in the West a good intellectual tradition historically derived from the Renaissance, the Enlightenment movement, and religious reform. I came from China to study in Denmark, and I thought that the values and the intellectual exchange were so conducive. There were values of freedom of research, freedom of speech, of thinking, freedom of the press, to be open-minded to different interpretations, to different aspects and perspectives, to be critical of the so-called mainstream opinions, quote, the only truth, and to be critical to any given authoritative discourse, to accommodate different approaches and methods, and to tolerate opposite ideas and understandings. The West had tremendous self-confidence after the Cold War, he wrote, because of its sentiment of triumphalism prevailed. But right now, facing the rise of China, the rise of the BRICS, and the rise of emerging powers, together with an assertive Russia, such self-confidence is being lost, especially during the period of the Ukraine war. The most serious loss, he wrote, is the disappearance of the above intellectual traditions. So that was Li Xing's response. The other speakers who I spoke to, they were very happy for the combination of speakers and the important exchange during the seminar. So as Dennis laid out, these two conferences, then in addition, the one that Richard just spoke about, where we were not directly, but maybe indirectly involved, these conferences will kick off the organizing process for the bigger Schiller Institute June 18th to 19th online conference. So please help to make this the biggest and most significant conference ever. The world situation demands nothing less.
Thank you, Michelle. And now I've got a few things for you and Richard. We have been putting up the questions and answers banner, and there are several matters, but there's one thing I wanted to make sure to have the two of you address in various ways, because of course there have been responses both just before and also somewhat just after the conference, good responses, and then some not so good. Here's one. And this is from an organization called the Ukraine Center for Countering Disinformation. And they were very worried about Colonel Richard Black. And here's what they had to say. The other day, several English language media outlets published an interview with R. Black in which the former U.S. Senator said that Russia could not afford to lose the war with Ukraine because, in his opinion, Russia's defeat would mean that, quote, NATO would move to the borders without hindrance from Russia. Interestingly, the expert did not mention Finland and Sweden, which border Russia, and it was because of the aggression of a neighbor that they decided to become members of the alliance. We warn you, such statements of the expert, in quotes, are an element of the information and psychological operation of the enemy, which is trying to convince the West of the futility of helping Ukraine. Now, this is a group run out of the Ukrainian president's National Security and Defense Council and is apparently coordinating its ongoing work with various countries from NATO. Just like to get a response from both of you to that. And then I've got something extra special for you, Richard, as soon as I think we'll be able to bring this up on the screen in a minute. But first, if any thoughts about this, and particularly given, Michelle, this reference that they make to the Finland and Sweden situations.
Richard, please go first.
Well, clearly the puppet Ukrainian government, which is being victimized by London and Washington, is hysterical and frightened because Colonel Black, who speaks with limitless authority on the matters in which he addressed, I think his speech now has his speech and recent interview has upwards of 500,000 views internationally, is being picked up by websites all over the world, and the truth is gripping people and shifting potentially world and U.S. opinion. I found their statement, which I had read earlier, somewhat threatening, and I think it indicates they're quite concerned that the universal narrative of the Ministry of Truth run out of London, the narrative is not being accepted. And if you look at our series of conferences over the recent period, more and more individuals are speaking out. And one of the characteristics of the Thursday conference is you had two extraordinarily distinguished American veterans with decades and decades of experience in ideological battle and physical battle, Colonel Richard Black and Ray McGovern, speaking out clearly and with arguments that cannot be avoided. So I think they're quite concerned, and we're going to escalate from here.
Okay, Michelle, anything?
Yes. Well, the question is really how you deal with the current situation, how you, for example, in terms of Sweden and Finland joining NATO. Sweden and Finland have been neutral countries, especially Sweden, for a couple hundred years. Sweden has seen its role more as negotiating peace between different factions. We have all heard about the Oslo Agreement in Oslo, Norway, where the Palestinians, the Norwegians were instrumental in getting the Palestinians and the Israelis to make a very important agreement at that time, the time that President Clinton was president. The question is, here after the Ukraine war, leading politicians in Denmark, in Sweden, and in Finland decide that the way to deal with this is to up the militarization, to have Sweden and Finland become members of NATO. At this time, this has to be seen, but in any viewpoint, as a tremendous provocation to Russia. Finland has a border, I think, of around 1,200 kilometers with Russia. If NATO moves in to Finland with Sweden just behind it, if NATO moves into Finland with advanced weapons, maybe even stationing nuclear weapons, what are the Russians going to do? Is this going to increase or decrease the possibility of solving conflicts peacefully? In Denmark, a week before the outbreak of the Ukraine war, it was announced that Denmark would start negotiations with the United States for a bilateral defense treaty, which is expected to have, for the first time in peacetime, permanent stationing of foreign troops in Denmark, meaning American troops permanently stationed in Denmark. And at that time, this was 1 week before the outbreak of the Ukraine war, and I personally was at the press conference asking a question to the Prime Minister. But at that time, another journalist asked the Prime Minister, what about the stationing of nuclear weapons on Danish soil? And the Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, who is the leader of the one-party social democratic government, she said, no, absolutely not. No talk about stationing nuclear weapons here. The week after, at the press conference when this national defense compromise was announced, including the referendum I spoke about, including also increasing the Danish defense budget to 2% of the national budget as NATO had been asking for. Two of the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party in Europe, liberal does not mean left-leaning. In Europe, liberal means more kind of small government against big government, but it's a right-leaning party. In any case, the two parties would ask, if the United States in these bilateral negotiations wants to station nuclear weapons in Denmark, what do you say? And both of them said the same thing. Oh, we'll just have to talk about that. In other words, they're open for this possibility. If we have stationing of offensive weapons, even maybe nuclear weapons, whatever, is this going to be an increase in the ability to lessen tensions, or an increase in the tensions? And will it add to the threat of nuclear war, or will it decrease the threat of nuclear war? And this is one of the main reasons that we are saying that Sweden and Finland should not join NATO. And even though the governments have now announced their intention to apply, there still can be political mobilization to stop it. But as I said, and as we began this webcast with, we have to look at these national questions in the greater perspective. What do we have to do to create a new security architecture with economic development, which would include Russia and China and India, and lay the basis for peaceful coexistence?
Let me just let people know that the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation, which will hereby be referred to as the Ukrainian Center for Disinformation, has also attacked Helga Zepp-LaRouche apparently today and Ray McGovern yesterday. I don't have the exact quotes of what they said, just know that occurred. To be clear, they have coordinated their actions with various ambassadors and other members of the EU and NATO in terms of some of these discussions. But now, Richard, I want to come to something, given this discussion that we just had, it was a little bit more of a deep dive. Wanted to get your response to this because you were emphasizing in your report on the conference that occurred this week involving the Eurasian Economic Union and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. You referenced that Russia sees itself as a scientific nation and is developing along that line. Of course, it has been. But there's a very particular thing I wanted to get your reaction to. This week, Executive Intelligence Review came upon a report that had actually been written in 2020 by the RAND Corporation called Whose Story Wins? And it has a longer title referring to the study of the work on the noosphere of Vladimir Vernadsky. They coined a silly term called noopolitik, which is supposed to supersede realpolitik. But there's a particular feature I want to get your response to, since you're acquainted from your work at the United Nations with some of these kind of operations. So here's what they have to say. They say, as a result of Vladimir Vernadsky's early work on the biosphere and noosphere, Noos-related concepts have grown in stature in Russia more than has been recognized. Spin-offs from Vernadsky's thinking include the Galactic Research Institute and its Foundation for the Law of Time, along with an online activity it organized in 2012, the first Noosphere World Forum. These and other New Age activities might not matter for thinking about American information strategy and diplomacy, but they do indicate the influences Vernadsky and his Russian scientist colleagues have had, not only in Russia, but also in odd circuits around the world. In particular, the far-right radical Lyndon LaRouche became a devotee of Vernadsky's ideas, which are still promoted by his followers. Now, a little later in that document, they state this, just after, but a couple of paragraphs are interpolated in between. But they say, this has aroused speculations about whether Putin's ideas for a, quote, third way and, quote, managed democracy might mean that he aims to install a newocracy, a term from Plato reiterated by Vernadsky that means rule of the wise for authoritarian, mind-manipulating purposes. Now, my idea is not that you necessarily need to comment in detail about the absurd document, but I thought it might, besides giving you a chuckle, give you an opportunity to say a little bit about this matter. and our relationship as an
I
organization
mean,
to these matters?
my response is it's time to take out the garbage. I mean, this is all gobbledygook. One of the lies, there are a whole series of lies being perpetrated by British intelligence, uh, as to what Michelle was addressing a minute ago. The whole idea that Russia is a threat to Sweden and Finland is absurd on the face of it. Russia has no intention whatsoever of moving east. Russia is not the Soviet Union. That was 30 years ago. Russia is a different state, a democratic state, a state with an independent central bank, a state with its own economic problems. Uh, what Russia is interested in doing is moving east, that is, developing Siberia. And in fact, it is doing that as part of the reconstruction plan that Putin has outlined. When President Putin went to India a number of weeks ago, he signed 15 industrial and scientific deals with Indian companies and the government for the industrial development of Siberia, which has never been developed. So what you're dealing with is a series of lies and axioms which only have credibility in Europe and in America because people are so badly educated and so depressed. So they don't have the energy to resist and they don't have the knowledge to resist. On this question of going from Vernadsky to Putin, the autocrat, it's absurd. I mean, this goes to the question of universal culture, not American culture, not Russian culture. Schiller's idea of universal culture. Russia has contributed immensely to mankind's knowledge of the relationship between man and the universe. Mendeleev, his discovery of the laws of the harmonic laws of the elements, the beauty of the creation itself. Vernadsky made breakthroughs from the standpoint of the relationship between physical nature and the nature of the human mind and the connection between the two and the superior role of the human mind within the universe as a whole. These were contributions to universal culture. And what's going on now, from the Rand Corporation on down, is a lying demonization of Russia, the creation of a Feindbild, an enemy image, in order to allow nuclear war to proceed. So basically, what you just read is garbage. It's propaganda, and most of the nations of the globe know it.
Yeah, let's turn to something a bit more rooted in reality, and I want to direct this initially to you, Michelle, but for reasons which will be very clear. There have been several questions or sort of interests around why we referenced, well, not why we referenced the shootings at the beginning, but the fact that we referenced those. And we have one thing from Erica from Alabama. I want to just tell you a little bit about this. The background is this, that Erica and her husband, Scott Muhammad, run something called the Tuskegee Memorial Gardens. They've created, because of the shootings that have happened in that area and other areas, what they've done is create an area where they plant trees, which are memorial trees for those who have been killed in violence. And what they try to do is to bring together the parents of the deceased, of the murdered, and the parents of the murderers. And they've done this on several occasions. And what happens in these occasions is that people realize that, first of all, they're often even related. That is, literally related. There are other kinds of revelations that happen. The main thing that occurs is that the idea of trying to get at something that heals the relationship in which the parents are either mystified by what their children have done or feel completely both guilt-ridden about it and then at the same time don't know what to do about it. So they've been doing this for about 2 years. Recently, they themselves became the target of people shooting at them and so on in this apartment complex. But the issue of the question, the thing being posed here is, you referenced that the war is indeed a tragedy. And we also see that in the case of these recent shootings, that no one actually deals with what the cultural factor is. People talk about guns, or they talk about some other way of passing a piece of legislation. And it's clear that that doesn't change what's in the human heart. And so the issue is how to change the culture that produces this kind of effect, and the relationship between the culture, that is to say, the actual activity, the day-to-day lives of people, and these broader international questions of war and peace.
Well, it's actually interesting. I'm reading both a biography and a book about on the occasion of was published on the occasion of the 125th anniversary of what would have been Mahatma Gandhi's birth. And one of the things that he stresses is that the inner motivations, the private life, and this is also something that LaRouche always stressed, is that the private life of people and what they do in society, they have to be in coherence. And one of the things that Mahatma Gandhi was always striving to work with himself to have, and to reform his spirit so that he would not be just thinking about the material things, just thinking about himself, his career, and thinking about the sensual pleasures, but was thinking about humanity. This is also what LaRouche stressed, that we have to have a culture where we're thinking about love not only of our relatives, but love of strangers, of what we call in Greek agape. In Danish, the word is næstekærlighed, which means love of the next person. And the question is, and this is what the Schiller Institute has been so adamant about, why we have culture as such an important part of our activities. Because the question is, how can you use culture to raise the moral level of the individual, to be a good Samaritan, as Schiller says, not just because it's your duty, but because it's something you don't even think about that you do. And if we have a culture of violence, if we have movies that are elevating violence as great entertainment, if we, Helge has many times spoken against the violent video games, but also in our day-to-day relations with our co-workers, with people in school, if the passion is how to beat out the other one instead of a joyous collaboration, these personal attributes then have a great consequence of the direction of our society. So, and this can also be a key of peaceful relations and a strategy for getting more peaceful relations. If we, as Helge many times has said, if we start investigating and reading about other cultures, if we start listening to music of other cultures, reading philosophy of other cultures, the history of other cultures, looking at the art and the poetry, that this uplifts us to the point that we are not fearful of the others. We're not fearful of the strangers, but we are embracing them, and we are joyful that there is a mosaic of different cultures, which just enriches us.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Richard, you have any comment?
Well, this idea of this precious idea that Michelle is talking about acting on behalf of all humanity, acting for the benefit of the other. We see this has a certain currency in international affairs. China's policy of win-win collaboration with well over 100 nations around the globe expresses a very, I think, profound philosophical idea that if oneself or one's nation develops your powers of insight and production and contribution, well, this is a universal contribution, and by its nature, it's collaborative with other individuals and other nations. So China, the hallmark of China's diplomacy now is win-win cooperation. Of course, the cynics of the U.S. Eastern establishment and the London press all mock this as Jesus was mocked. But I was very interested to see that Ray McGovern made this a centerpiece of his discussion in terms of policy about the outstanding approach of China now in pursuit of peace, which is win-win collaboration. And Ray McGovern said, yes, this is the way to go. The well-known economist in Texas, James Galbraith, recently wrote a piece analyzing China's economy. And he said they are doing a fabulous job. And the more fabulous they do, the more enraged and outraged the West becomes. The new ambassador from China to the U.S., Ambassador Chin, he's spending his time, almost full time, touring America. As you know, Dennis, he was in Iowa meeting with farmers and political leaders and civic groups. He was in Atlanta touring factories. He was just on the West Coast meetings with citizens organizations, promoting this idea of there is such a thing, and it's the most profound thing, of universal interest. So, I mean, what part of the work of the Schiller Institute, absolutely, is to give currency to this idea that there's a universal good, and each nation has a special characteristic capability to make a contribution to that universal good. This was the outlook of FDR.
May I just add one sentence?
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, back to the idea of tragedy. Of course, the greatest playwrights, from Aeschylus to Schiller to Shakespeare, they wrote tragedies. Now, why did they write tragedies? It was not because they were misogynists. It's not because they wanted to have people suffer who watched these tragedies, but they wanted to have people learn from the tragedies of what not to do, what we could have done differently to avoid the tragedy. And in our time, both in terms of what you're speaking about, the school shootings and the tragedy of the war in Ukraine, the tragedy of the other wars that we've had, Afghanistan, etc. The tragedy will be if we do not learn from the tragedy. We must learn from the tragedies and do something different next time. The tragedy will be if we don't learn from the tragedy.
Okay, Richard, this question is from Greg Witherspoon, and he asked this. He says, St. Louis was once some years ago going to be a center for Chinese investment to redo the area as a transportation hub for water, high-speed rail, and the transshipment of goods throughout the United States because of its central location. This goes back about 15 years now. It was stopped and nothing was done. This is the same area, St. Louis and also East St. Louis, where Ferguson happened. That was the killing and the riots that happened some years back. Nothing has changed here. Is there some way to use the candidacies for office, since it is 2022, an election year in the United States, to resurrect some of these sorts of projects?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, absolutely. It's been the case for many years now that the Chinese government and Chinese companies have offered to bid on major infrastructure projects, St. Louis, Boston, high-speed rail up and down the East Coast. And at each point, it's been blocked by Wall Street. I was at a public meeting a few years ago where a collaborator of ours, this was the topic: how could you rebuild America's totally collapsed infrastructure? And this collaborator of ours, who happened to be a filmmaker, got up and he said, well, look, China owns trillions of dollars of U.S. Treasury bonds. Couldn't they be in some way converted into an infrastructure bank with the United States, and the U.S. and China together could invest in rebuilding America's infrastructure? One of the people on the panel was the very ancient Hank Greenberg, the head of the the AIG insurance group. And he jumped out of his chair and said, no, absolutely not. We're not going to allow any investment by China in the United States. So this is the Anglo-American genocidal elite. These are the people who continue to write off Central America, South America, and Africa, and that's the enemy. But it absolutely is the case. It would work instantly. Remember, President Xi Jinping offered to Obama to join the Belt and Road Initiative in its early years. She has made the offer again and again and again. It would work in a flash, in an instant. What's required in the United States is we have to have a bigger movement with large numbers of people who are influentials, who are speaking out, and political campaigns. And of course, here in the New York area, Diane Sayre is going to be filing for U.S. Senate in a hotly contested election. She's already being given interviews internationally, and thousands and thousands of people have signed a petition and again have said to her petitioners, thank you, God bless you for what you're doing. So with our campaigns in Texas, with Joel DeJohn running for Congress, Diane Sayre, it's being met with great relief, excitement, and enthusiasm. So what's required is a mass movement behind candidates and leading intellectuals like the ones that we saw speak at these two conferences this week out of Denmark and the one organized out of the U.S. This is what we have to organize. And we have to put our heads together on how to accelerate that in the cauldron of the threat of an imminent nuclear annihilation.
Okay, and Michelle, this is from one of our young organizers who writes this. This is Jose, actually. I came around on the idea of the revival of classical culture, and also did a broadcast on December 16th, 2020, in honor of Beethoven. I know that you have composed music. I briefly met the composer Alma Deutscher at Carnegie Hall in 2018, and I think that young people should take up the challenge to do what Beethoven and others did. What do you think about this?
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm continuing my own studies about the teaching method that Alma Deutscher was schooled in, which helped her to be able to compose such beautiful music. For those who don't know about Alma Deutscher, she's a British young woman. Her father was Israeli, her mother is British. Now the family moved to Vienna, the capital of classical composition. But in any case, she started composing music at the age of 4. And her father tried to get a composition teacher for her and basically got laughed at until he found a book that was written about a method called partimenti in Italian. This was a method which was used to train orphan boys in Italy from around the 1600s up until the 1800s to learn to compose as a craft, as you would teach carpentry or masonry. They learned to compose music, but they learned they had a special pedagogy, which started with singing for 3 years, and then they learned to start composition based on being given a bass line. And then from this baseline, the task was, how can you invent one or more beautiful horizontal voices that interweaves with the given baseline to produce a beautiful music. Polyphonic music. That means polyphonic means many voiced music. So you're given one voice, and then you learn how to compose 1 or 2 or 3 additional voices to make a beautiful whole. And this method is now being revived also due to the way that Alma Deutscher's music has brought tears to the eyes of many people, both because she was so young, but also because she composed beautiful music in the classical tradition, and she has been courageous enough to make a polemic against ugliness in art, and a kind of mission for the composition of beautiful music. So this is something that, just like anybody can learn to sing, anybody can learn to compose music. There is, it's not esoteric, hidden knowledge, but the whole idea of this movement is to make it this pedagogy apparent, so that people can use it. And there may be other things in addition to this. This might not be the only thing, but it is one pedagogical method for encouraging every child and every adult, as I say, not only to sing, but to compose beautiful music.
Okay, so we're pretty much at the end of the program, and what I'd like to do is to introduce something because of the theme of the overall program, which is the enemy us or only our British imperial axioms? And I ask both of you in sort of your concluding statements to respond to something we'll put up on the screen from Lyndon LaRouche, and it was from a document that he wrote back in October 1977 called NATO in Caesar's Foolish Footsteps. He said, "It is that British ideology, as it permeates Anglo-American and NATO policies, and as that same mental disease continues to impair the judgment of America's policy-making strata, which we confront. During the 18th century, the forces of evil centered around the British ruling Guelph monarchical house, and the heirs of the evil nominalists, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, occupied themselves in the study of the fall of the Roman Republic and the emergence of the Roman Empire. This study was directed to the purpose of educing from the study of the Roman Empire a political art by which the British monarchy and its accomplices could develop a global rule of Pax Britannica as the intended successor to the Pax Romana. The anti-humanist or bestialist outlook is properly called bestialist because, like Thomas Hobbes or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, it denies any qualitative distinction between man and the lower beasts. It denies any fundamental importance for scientific knowledge, and most frequently has stated that quantitative advances in scientific knowledge have been virtually exhausted, as Bertrand Russell and John Dewey insisted during the 1920s. So I want to get your responses to this as we summarize, because obviously Lynn writing this, what was that, 45 years ago, talking about NATO in Caesar's foolish footsteps, and then identifying this as a disease, but placing it from the standpoint of the conception of mankind and the flaw that it represents. I think that that's an important idea for us to flesh out as we try to get people ready for the next 3 weeks and what they're going to be doing to build this conference. So I guess I'd like to start with you first, Richard, and then go to Michelle.
It's clear that America and Europe needs a renaissance. The contrast between what goes on in America and in Western Europe, for instance, and what's going on in China is embarrassing, astounding, amazing. What about the China miracle? The unbelievable expansion of their economic and scientific capability, which expands by the month. Their eradication of 850,000 cases of extreme poverty, the elimination of extreme poverty in all of China. Their breakthroughs in one area of science, one after the other, including agriculture, and the transfer of technology to the global south. What's happening here? What's happening in America? The shutdown of nuclear power, the banning of petrochemicals, the destruction of science in the schools, the elimination of music and art in the schools. So, I mean, what we're looking at, if you look at the world as a whole, back to our initial conception, you see that, yes, we have done this to ourselves. As Michelle's friend indicated, he came to the West because of the earned reputation in the West for free discussion, the power of ideas, open dialogue, open-ended contention in the fight for truth. The problem is he came to the West a little bit too late when we decided to shut ourselves down, or at least the elites did. I just want to emphasize the fact that the tremendous economic advance and success of China today has an important cultural and aesthetic aspect. And as we've discussed at various locations, since 2008, in China, there's been a big emphasis on aesthetic education for very young students in China. That means classical Western music. It means classical Chinese music. It means a revival of Confucius, who was attacked and banned during the Cultural Revolution. Really, among some of the elites in China, typified by its president, there is a call for an aesthetical upshifting of the entire society. And this is part of the secret to the tremendous productivity of Chinese science and the Chinese economy. That's what America had been known for. In the Revolutionary War generation, John Quincy Adams, the period all through the 1800s, America was envied and loved for that capability. It saw its light again in the decade plus under the great Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that's something we've lost. And if we don't reverse it, we may lose the world as a whole. So that defines a very urgent task for us, a certain kind of spiritual task, I would say.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Michelle?
Yes, it all really comes down to an image of man and women, image of humanity. Because the question of security is, do we approach the relationship between nations from the standpoint of the bestial view of man, that it is it is a war between nations. Nations are at war with each other. People are always at war with each other. People are fundamentally egotistical, greedy, ambitious, the bestial view of man? Or do we have a positive view of human beings with a creative spark of reason, that human beings can create beautiful music, human beings can create beautiful poetry, artwork, can create new scientific discoveries? And the question is, do we have political leaders who operate based on the one view of man or the other? Do we have an electorate which allows their political leaders or chooses their political leaders on the basis of one party against beating the other, coming out on top? Or do we have the idea of collaboration for the benefit of all? And one thing I would like to stress is one of the most basic ideas of the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche movement has been the slogan, peace through economic development. That we cannot just have defense organizations like NATO, which see the world as us and them, but we have to have, it's the power of economic cooperation, the whole vision that Lynn and Helga had after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, finally, we have the chance to have economic development amongst and between all the countries that before had been severed by an Iron Curtain, and before that by Nazism and fascism. But here, finally, we had the opportunity to have joint Eurasian economic development, and as Lynn always stressed, the economic development in our part of the world as a motor for economic development in Africa, Asia, South America. So it is really up to us to that we have to be on a mission for expressing this higher viewpoint, this higher image of man, and then developing political and economic strategies that embody that higher image of humanity. And it's nothing less than that will be able to steer us clear in these stormy waters.
All right. Michelle Rasmussen, Richard Black, I want to thank you very much for being with us today. And I think we've addressed, at least in part, the concerns that have only begun to be addressed by what Helga has wanted to do with these conferences. And I want to say a few things in conclusion now today for those who may have joined us during the broadcast or were not there at the beginning when we referenced the agony and tragedy of the two shootings in the United States, one in Buffalo and one in Texas. Many things are coming out about these. Details are emerging, but it doesn't really matter. The detail does not matter. What matters is to look at the phenomenon. This has been going on for 23 years in the United States, but there's something else to be looked at. The reality of what the United States does, rather than what the United States says, is most reflected in how it treats its most vulnerable and impressionable, and that is its youth. And it's also the case, as all of us who were youth know, that young people know who you really are, and they look at who you really, how you really behave. Now, in the United States, just under 1,000 children are murdered each year. And that shows something about our thinking as a nation. The evil that is practiced in killing and murder in faraway lands is the evil that is also found in the American household. And if nothing is changed, America will be eaten by its own children. That's not because they are the evil, in the same way that the possessed that Christ drove the devils out of were not the enemy. They were possessed. They were called demoniacs, as they were called. At the same time, the good that has been invented by the United States, which is, after all, the longest continuous democratic republic in the world, is in its founding documents and its invention of what's called the science of physical economy. Now, it's not the originator of it. That was Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in 1672. But it was the follower of Leibniz, Benjamin Franklin, who advanced that here in the United States through his inheriting of Leibniz's intelligence and scientific networks. Leibniz died in 1716. Benjamin Franklin was born in 1706. And by the age of 16, by 1722, had embarked upon creating what became known as the American Revolution. It was a conscious conspiracy to do that, which was launched originally in Boston, but then became rooted in Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia, 1722. That American Revolution boasted the most successful intelligence network in history, run by Benjamin Franklin, but featuring and advanced particularly by George Washington, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, the Marquis de Lafayette, and others. The four Hamilton reports are the primary statement of the revolutionary, anti-colonial, and pro-development outlook, which was an American outlook that was in fact adopted at the Bandung Conference of 1955 in Indonesia by what was then called the Third World. That was over the objections of British intelligence agents John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, who happened to run the State Department of the United States and its CIA. And the outlook that we see being expressed by the Jake Sullivans and Blinkens and others is essentially the bastard child of that John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles betrayal of the American system and of the American intelligence community. The arrogance of the Georgetown set, the Dumbarton Oaks set, that they and not the British were the real power, has to be laid to rest. Winston Churchill recognized that the real empire was the empire of the mind, as he called it. What we have to do is we have to cause this country to abandon our British imperial axioms, and then we will once again be Americans. We will once again be free. And on the basis of that, this country can enter into alliance with and collaboration with Russia, China, India, and others in a way that is not only win-win from some economic standpoint, but win-win for humanity and civilization as a whole. So I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's Manhattan Town Meeting. We want to encourage you all to work with us over the next 3 weeks for the upcoming June 18th and 19th Schiller Institute Conference. We want to also obviously recognize veterans of the wars, of the just wars that the United States and other nations have fought, this being Memorial Day weekend. We want to thank you all for being with us today and hope to see you again here next week.